Those of you who've been around church organisations for a while will know that one of the more grotesque tendencies of organisations like our own is that in order to define the boundaries of religious orthodoxy, they do the kind of thing we've just seen. They craft creeds of conduct that oblige Christians or would-be Christians to abstain from certain substances and refrain from certain activities. Some of you, I know, will have experience of being in a church where you weren't allowed to have a glass of beer or see the latest Hollywood movie. Some of you will have experience of being in a church where you were required to abstain from certain foods on certain days and during certain religious festivals. And what those churches and churches like them do is they essentially draw an ever-decreasing circle of acceptability around themselves and then reject everyone else who fails to conform to their very, very narrow version of truth. And so the only people who are tolerated in those kinds of religious environments, the only people whose faith is taken seriously, are their own religious clones. People who think like they think, who behave like they behave. And this morning's Bible reading talks about the whole business of somebody else trying to impose their morality, their scruples and their hang-ups onto you. Let's have our first sentence up on the screen and we'll get going. Should have fun this morning. So we're looking at the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians, chapter 2 and verse 16, which says to the church, "Don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival such as a new moon celebration or a Sabbath day." When Paul uses the word judge at the start of that sentence, what he means is that people in the church were being taken to task by other people in the church. And that which they were being taken to task over was their attitude to food and drink. Now, just to give you a little bit of background here, many of the key players in the early church were Jews. And one of the big issues in ancient Judaism was the foods that you weren't allowed to eat. As you perhaps know, there are sentences in the Old Testament that prohibit a person from eating pork and blood sausage and scallops and so on. And so being Jewish in those days meant not eating those things, and that was fine. However, as the world became more and more cosmopolitan, as more and more Jews travelled to other parts of the world, as people from other parts of the world travelled to Israel, Jews discovered that bacon, in fact, tastes quite good. And in the centuries before Christ, Jewish society became polarised around this very simple issue. Some people embraced the new modern bacon-eating ways, and that was fine for them. However, other people became increasingly conservative, and they violently rejected those modern ways as a betrayal of their Jewish culture. And in the centuries before Jesus was born, this was a huge issue in Jewish society. So much so that about 200 years before the birth of Christ, a group of very conservative Jews took up arms and started to riot. And one of the issues at stake during these violent riots was food. Have a look at this sentence. This comes from a Jewish historical text called the book of 1 Maccabees, a great book. And it says that many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than be defiled by food, and they did die. So this actually happened, and it gives you an idea of how strongly they took this issue. When given the choice, bacon sandwich or death? Bacon sandwich or death? They chose death, and gladly so. And they did so because not eating certain kinds of foods, abstaining from certain behaviours, was one of the ways that they thought they had to demonstrate loyalty to the God in whom they believed. They were willing to kill and be killed over what a person put in between their bread. And after a series of very bloody conflicts, those people won the argument. The conservatives won. And so 200 years later, by the time of Jesus, the unquestioned view in Jewish society was that following God properly, being the real deal in religious terms, meant not eating certain things, not drinking certain drinks. And this very quickly became a problem for the Christian church. The church started out in Israel, most of them were Jews, that was fine. But then as the decades progressed and as the church began to take root in the cities of the Roman Empire, many of its early converts were non-Jews. And as non-Jews, the issue of having a bacon sandwich or certain glasses of wine was a non-issue. And so here these Christians were in church. They've found faith. Jesus is working for them. They're doing their best to live a Christian life. And then one Sunday, a well-meaning Jewish preacher comes to church. And he looks at people like you. And he says, whoa, 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 whoa. You're not the real deal. You're not a legitimate Christian. And the reason I know that is because of the food that you eat and the wine that you drink. The issue with wine, of course, was that in the Roman Empire it tended to be dedicated to Roman gods like Bacchus and so on, and that was an issue for some people. And so the content of this judgmental conversation that was happening in church was that you are not a real Christian because you are consuming the wrong substances, you're behaving in wrong ways, therefore you need to stop doing what you're doing so that you can be a real Christian. Okay? And the other thing that they were being taken to task over was their non-observance of certain religious festivals of the Jewish faith, new moons and Sabbaths and so on. So clearly, the people who were standing where I'm standing and were doing all of this criticizing and laying all of this guilt on ordinary Christian men and women, they were very serious people. They were evidently very careful about what they ate, very careful about what they drank. They took real care to make sure that they observed the proper religious festivals in the proper religious way. And all of their care and correct living inevitably led them to being critical, judgmental people. Have you ever noticed that the most moral people are also the most horrible people? They're the most boring and most horrible people you'll ever meet. And that just makes sense. After all, if I'm convinced that abstaining from certain substances and certain behaviours is necessary because God approves of such abstentions, then it follows that God does not approve of everyone else who lives differently. If I'm right, that means you must be wrong. If I'm living the right way, you must be living the incorrect way, which gives me permission to do two things. First of all, it gives me permission to feel really great about myself and pat myself on the back. Look at me, I don't eat the wrong foods or drink the wrong drinks or dance with the wrong kind of women. Okay, I'm good. Well done, me, right? At least I never get the chance to do those things anymore. You get that age, don't you, where temptation just avoids you. It just sucks. None of that's in the script. Can we edit that from the video? My mum's watching this.
Sorry.
Right, so first of all, it gives me permission to feel great about myself, and then it gives me permission to criticize you, and judge you, and lay a whole bunch of guilt onto you. In the next sentence, Paul says to the church who are feeling all this guilt, who are suddenly feeling like they're not real Christians, he says, listen, listen, listen. These rules of the Old Testament are, and he uses a strange phrase, a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Now, in this sentence, Paul is alluding to a very popular, at least it was a popular story in his day, told by this man. This is Plato, Greek philosopher, also invented plates, as you know. Seriously, before Plato, no one knew whether to eat on. Now, Plato was very interested in the relationship between the material and the non-material world. That was Plato's thing. And So he told this story to his students. He said, think of it like this. Imagine there's a guy standing at the entrance to a cave with the sun behind him. The sun will cast a shadow onto the wall of the cave. Well, that shadow obviously isn't real. It's... Yeah, would you close the door? I'm hearing music and I want to be there rather than here. That shadow in the back of the cave is just a reflection of what's real and what's substantial. Now, Paul wouldn't have agreed with the conclusions that Plato arrived at, but he does allude to this story because his audience would have all known about it. And so he takes the illustrations and he says that's how it is for the Old Testament. He says many of these strange rules and sentences that you read in the Old Testament, they're not actually real. All they are is a shadow of something that is real. And he's saying, so think of it like this. All that weird, crazy stuff you read about in your Bible when you were a kid, about not eating bacon, and about God being grumpy all the time, and about fire and temples and sacrifices and blood and weird, funky stuff, all of that was just a shadow at the back of the cave. The reality that that shadow represents, however, is Jesus. And so you as Christians now know that when Jesus comes to perfectly live the life you should have lived, to perfectly die a death for your sins on your behalf, the shadows disappear. The shadows become unnecessary and redundant. Jesus is all that's left. Jesus is all you need as a Christian. Therefore, next sentence, do not let anyone who delights in false humility or the worship of angels disqualify you. Now, in this sentence, Paul's talking about some very specific things that were happening in this particular church. Remember, these are Christians who are being laden with a guilt trip. And the people who are laying this guilt trip on them, they're awesome Christians. Do you know what I mean? Way more Christian than you are. Like more Christian than the Pope. Those kind of Christians. And the first thing those kind of people are doing as they lay a guilt trip on you is they're delighting in what he calls humility. Now, normally in the Bible, the word humility means something like, be modest, don't be too up yourself. However, in this case, the word is used slightly differently. Sometimes in the ancient world, when the writers used, when writers used the word humility, they were using it to describe the whole business of controlling your body by either fasting or by eating a severely restricted diet. And that's the sense that Paul uses the word here in this sentence. He's saying there's people in your church who are laying a guilt trip on you, and they just love to tell you all the time about the various ways in which they're controlling their bodies and restricting the things that they eat and the amount that they eat and the days that they eat. And then he says the second thing that these people are delighting in all the time is what he calls the worship of angels. Now, when he talks about worshipping angels, he doesn't mean that they're worshipping angels. He means something slightly nuanced. In the ancient world, Jews believed that God was too holy to be worshipped directly. And so they developed the idea of angel worship, by which they meant, if we fast for long enough, like if we don't eat 3 days before church, and, maybe if we smoke something funny, when we get to church on a Sunday and we do our church thing, we'll have a hallucinogenic experience. And in that experience, we'll be transported into heaven alongside the angels, and we'll participate in the worship that the angels give to God. That's kind of what they mean in this sentence. And in Jewish spirituality, and particularly first century Jewish mysticism, this was the ultimate spiritual experience. To have this feeling that you left your body and kind of, joined the congregation of the angels around the throne of God in heaven. Next slide, please. So these are the remains of the Jewish commune in Qumran. This, as you perhaps know, is where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. And the people who lived here at the time of the New Testament were known for two things. The first thing that they were known for was living by a very strict set of aesthetic rules. Living in the Qumran community was like living in fat camp, but forever. So there were pages and pages of dietary rules that you had to follow. There were regular periods of fasting that you had to perform. And the second thing that this community was known for was having hallucinogenic, out-of-body experiences brought about by their strict food regime. And during these experiences, they claimed to be able to enter into the worship of the angels. Let me show you a line from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is from a thing called the Samuel document. It's quite interesting, at least it is to me. So what's happening here is a priest is talking to his very hungry congregation, and they're starting to feel a bit trippy. And he says to them, "May you be as an angel in the presence of the abode of holiness." In other words, as we're about to do our worship thing, may you leave your body and have this funky, trippy experience where you are actually alongside the angels in heaven. And of course the fasting and the visions were related. It was thought that the more you controlled your body, the more you were careful about what you did and what you didn't do, the greater the chance would be that you would have one of these mystical spiritual experiences. So that's going on in the church in Colossae. People are laying this guilt trip on the church. You don't have these experiences, do you? You're just a schlep, right? I mean, you're not a Christian. You're like a Christian, right? But you know the difference. Like, you don't have those things that other people have. You've never seen the things that those real Christians have seen. You're just kind of struggling through life badly. And it's a mess. That's how they were feeling as these people laid this guilt trip on them. And all of that was being mixed up a little bit with local pagan superstitions. So have a look at this. This is a spirit house in Thailand, a couple of them. So if you go to Thailand, you see these things all over the place. You see them outside people's houses, outside people's businesses, and people's fields. And for the most part, Thai people believe that the spirits who live in these spirit houses are quite changeable. They think one thing one minute and change their mind the next. I guess they're female spirits. That was quite good. Quite good. And so, if you don't do the right thing for these spirits, if you don't keep them happy all the time, they'll get you, right? So, for example, if you're a Thai person and you're opening a business, if you don't ask the permission and do something nice for the spirit who lives on that street corner, your business won't work. If you're buying a field and you don't build a nice spirit house, perhaps with teak and gold leaf for the spirit who has to do with that field, your crops might not grow, and so on and so forth. By the way, you can pick these things up for a couple of $100 in Thailand and flog them to hippies in California for a fortune. So, happy to help. Anyway, so all of that's happening in this church that Paul is writing to. People are doing whatever they can to have these real Christian experiences, and other people have seen angels, why haven't I? Maybe it's because I eat bacon sandwiches, maybe it's because I drank too much wine last night, maybe it's because I'm not a real Christian. And, if I could do that, maybe I could meet the angels and they would help me in business. And insofar as these people didn't have those experiences, insofar as they weren't real Christians, just like you sometimes feel you're not a real Christian, these super Christians were disqualifying them from Christianity. The word disqualify comes from the world of first century sport. Anyone been watching the tennis lately? No? Yeah. Oh yeah, one or two, okay. It's a pity. Anyway, so there's that guy in tennis, right? And he's the grumpy guy. He always says out. what do you call that guy?
Umpire.
The umpire, right? So someone makes a bad play and the ball goes out, the umpire says out. Out. Showing your age. In the first century, the disqualifier was the person who said this. So what these people who were standing where I am standing, who were laying this guilt trip on all these schleppy Christians like you, were saying, nah, you're out. Those moves you made last night, you're out. Those things you did this week, you're out. That stuff you drank, those people you were with, those deals you did, you're out. You're disqualified. It means you're not a real Christian. You need to stop doing your schleppy things and start doing what we do. And live as disciplined and as Christian a life as we do. Then you'll be better. Paul says, listen, these people who say these things, here's what they do. Here's what they do. They go into great detail about what they've seen. They're puffed up with idle notions in their unspiritual mind. When Paul uses the phrase goes into, he's using a technical phrase that came right out of the world of first century religious practice. In the ancient world, particularly first century Judaism, when a person went to the temple in Jerusalem, this was the phrase they used. They would enter into. I'm not going to the temple, I'm entering into the temple. And so here, outside the temple, is ordinary schleppy space where you live. Inside the temple where you enter into, that's sacred space. That's where you meet God. That's where you get if you're good enough. And that's what was happening in this church on a Sunday. The vibe was, here I am today, and I've lived a very careful life all week. I haven't eaten anything that I should not have eaten. I don't have any toxins in my body. On Thursday, I fasted. On Friday, I didn't eat meat. Not a drop of alcohol has touched my lips all week. My colon is squeaky clean. And so when we worshipped 5 minutes ago, I saw stuff you didn't see. You were singing, I was worshipping. You were listening, I was there with the angels, and so now you have to listen to what I have to tell you. Because I know stuff you now don't know. Paul says, listen, these people who say those things, they're not right in the head. They're nuts. These people who talk like that, they're nonsense. And the reason Paul has to say such strong words about them is because their nonsense is very appealing nonsense. I mean, here you are, here I am. We're not super Christians. We're just, I think the word schlep kind of describes where we're at. Two of us anyway. Right, I mean, we're into Jesus, right? We're trying to do the Jesus thing, and we try to follow Jesus, but our trying and our following is very imperfect, and it's done in very difficult circumstances, is it not? I mean, you don't live your Christianity in church. You live it, Monday to Saturday, and Monday to Saturday there's stuff going on. And sometimes the stuff is dirty, and sometimes the stuff is messy, and sometimes the stuff is complicated, and it's just hard, right? That's where you live your Christianity, and that's why it's always so difficult and imperfect. And yet there are other people who give the impression that that's not the case for them. There are other people who give the impression that their life is squeaky clean and they live by a very strict code all the time. And because that's the case, they know things you don't know, and they've experienced things you have not experienced, and don't struggle in the ways that you struggle. And those people immediately call into question the legitimacy of your Christianity. Their goodness shines a light on your alleged lack of goodness. And so it's inevitable that you may well think that maybe you should be as disciplined as they are. Maybe you are disqualified. I think we've all thought that. Maybe I'm not the real deal. Maybe that lurking suspicion that I have is true. Maybe I'm not a real Christian. Maybe Jesus doesn't like me after all. Maybe my faith isn't good enough. And at this point, Paul steps into the church and says, don't you dare think those things. Don't you dare let anyone else judge you. Don't you dare let anyone else ram their morality down your throat. Don't you dare let anyone lay a guilt trip on you and impose their boring lifestyle onto you. They're nuts. Don't do it. Especially those people, actually. Next sentence. Because those people who are laying a guilt trip on you for not being Christian enough, technically they're not Christian at all. He says they've lost connection with the head. When he uses the word head in that sentence, he of course means Jesus. Jesus in the New Testament is the head of the church. And it follows from a New Testament perspective that if you're going to follow Jesus, you need to rely on Jesus, because Christianity is about Jesus and about what Jesus has done and not what you can successfully do. And so Paul's argument would be, those people who are laying those guilt trips on you, their Christianity isn't about Jesus at all. Their Christianity is about how good they are at not doing bad stuff. Their Christianity is about how brilliant they are at not eating bacon and not getting wasted and not, hanging out with bad people and, dancing with the wrong girls and all that stuff. That's what their Christianity is about. If you're just a schleppy, struggling Christian, your Christianity is about Jesus and how you need him to forgive you. Which is better? Paul says in this sentence, these guys have lost sight of Christianity. Christianity is about Christ, who died on the cross for sins. Christianity isn't about getting better at being religious. It isn't about improving yourself morally in the same way that you can physically at the gym. It just isn't about that. It's about Jesus. Next sentence. He says, since you died with Christ to the elemental forces of this world, why, as though you still belonged to the world, do you submit to its rules? Let's go back to the photo of the Spirit House in Thailand. When a person becomes a Christian in Thailand, it's often difficult for them to give up the practice of placating the spirits. Their worldview, deeply ingrained, is that life is controlled by an array of finicky spirit beings who need to be humoured. This was also the worldview of the people to whom Paul is writing. These people lived in fear, in a dangerous world. They were driven by a cosmic uncertainty that constantly caused them to seek out protection and help from a wide variety of gods and spirits. And in that mix, this offer of, hey, the angels might be able to help you, was very appealing, right? In the face of life's uncertainties, in the face of all the bad things that can happen to you this week, here's something tangible that you can do. You can fast, you can abstain from alcohol, you can follow the aesthetic rules associated with a particular religious festival, you can get the angels on your side. All you need to do is do these concrete things. Submit to the rules, don't do this, do that. Then your life will be better. Paul says to the church, don't you dare go back to that silly thinking. You died to that. It's a powerful point he makes. Whatever binds you and burdens you in life ceases to bind you and burden you in death. If you have a particularly unpleasant boss whose constant and ever-growing and ever-changing list of demands makes your life a living hell, that hell ends at your wake. Were your boss to come to your wake and start nagging you about next week's cash flow or last month's sales reports, you're unlikely to care. Similarly, Paul says, you've died to all that silly stuff. You've died to the nagging, petty rules that religious people will ram down your irreligious throat. Jesus did away with it. So why do you submit yourself to it all over again? Why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you laying a guilt trip on your own fragile conscience. It's hard enough being a Christian. It's hard enough going through life with faith, coping with all the imperfect things you have to cope with. Why carry guilt as well? It's just silly. It doesn't do you any good. And then Paul goes on to give examples of the sorts of rules that these people were trying to impose. Don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. Classic religious rules. The thinking behind them is that you can become unclean by touching the wrong thing, ingesting the wrong substance. Interesting, there's no mention there of wrong behaviour. Just a list of rules. Don't do this, do that, and you'll be all right. And then he says, these rules, which have to do with the things that are destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. In other words, the rules that are about what you eat and drink don't get to the heart of what might be wrong with a person. But nonetheless, those rules do give the illusion of benefit. Next sentence. He says, such regulations do have an appearance of wisdom, with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Every Christian I know struggles with stuff. Messy stuff. Stuff the Bible calls sin. Every Christian I know lives their life in tension. On the one hand, they don't want to sin, but on the other hand, sin is tempting. And it's tempting because it tastes nice, and it feels nice, and it often offers certain benefits. Every Christian I know thinks that sinful things are somewhat abhorrent, but there are nevertheless occasions where they are also very appealing, and in the midst of all that tension that the Christian life is lived in, the allure of living an aesthetic, overly disciplined life can be a strong one. So the sales pitch went something like this. Your problem, I know you've struggled, I know you've lost, but your problem is that you're not in control of yourself. You're not in control of your desires. You're not in control of your appetites. So you need to get control by getting control of your body. So you need to eat less food and the right kind of food. You need to cleanse, you need to detox, you need to meditate, you need to fast. You need to subdue your body so that you can then learn to subdue your desires. You need to subdue your appetites physically so that you can subdue your appetites for those other things. And up to a point, I guess Paul and the Bible would be okay with that. There's nothing wrong, I suppose, with being self-disciplined. There's nothing wrong with living a aesthetic life if that's your thing. The problem with religious self-discipline is that it's not up to the task of restraining the human will or the human appetite, which for all of us is often so chronically into things that God would not wish us to be into. So the teaching of Christianity is far more radical. The teaching of Christianity is that Jesus actually, he didn't go on a diet on your behalf. Sometimes I wish he did. He died on your behalf. He was punished on your behalf. And that death in Christianity is somehow credited to you. And so the teaching of the New Testament is, you're already dead to all that stuff. You're a brand new man. You're a brand new woman who can now live a brand new life. Self-discipline has its benefits, but they're not that great. They really aren't. Paul, who wrote these words as a very well-disciplined individual, would know that self-discipline doesn't bring about the freedom that we seek. I try to be disciplined, I suppose, sometimes. So what do? I'm not that great, but I do these things. I try to limit the amount of television I watch. I don't really watch that much. I try sometimes to limit what I eat or watch what I eat. I don't drink all that much. I try to exercise sometimes. I try to avoid things that are bad for my body now and again. I am going to Ribfest after church. I try to avoid things that are bad for my soul. Sometimes I do that more successfully than others. And my experience has been that those things I try to do make a difference in my life, but the difference they make is very, very limited. If I'm dying in bed, and one day I suppose I will be, and you take it upon yourself to come and visit me and comfort me, I will take no comfort whatsoever from you coming to me and saying, Darren, you weren't that bad. I suppose. You try to do the right things sometimes, and you helped some people sometimes, and blah, blah, blah. The comfort I'll be looking for is, Darren, you were often a bit of an idiot. And Jesus died for people like you. And that's enough. And that's enough. The issue in the church in Colossae that Paul is writing to is that people are suggesting that comfort in the religious life is found not in what Jesus gives, but in what you can do for yourself, like trying hard to be a better Christian. Try as hard as you can, and then you'll find comfort in your faith. Paul says, no, it's all about Jesus. Jesus died for your sins so that you can be forgiven, and that is enough. That's plenty. And the better you are at obeying the rules, the better you are living a Christian life. It doesn't make any difference one way or another to that central Christian truth. Jesus died for you. And so those of you who are simple enough, I don't mean to offend when I call any of you simple. Let me choose a better word, slightly more offensive. Those of you who feel that you kind of suck at Christianity, that sometimes it's just not your gig. Not because you don't believe it, but because you're not good at it. Your appetites, your desires, your temptations, your failures, they get in the way too often. Those of you who occupy that space, and yet are simple enough to trust that Jesus' death on the cross is enough for you, you should not feel put down. You should not feel disqualified. Because Jesus is enough. He is enough. Always was. Always is. We have time for a couple of questions. As long as they're quick. Any questions? Yes. Think of the Bible as a story. The Bible is a story. And as a story, it has a beginning and it has an end, and it's the stuff in the middle that matters. So, and like all good stories, it has conflict. It has problems that need to be overcome. It has surprises. The best way to answer your question is to think of the Star Wars franchise. How crap would it have been if Star Wars started, there's a bad guy, and then we go straight to the bad guy got killed. 5 minutes, you can go home. The story of the Bible just doesn't make sense without the mess, and without the struggle, and without the really inexplicable things at the start of the movie that don't make sense until the end. And so that's how to think through those awkward things, particularly in the Hebrew Bible part of it. You know, it's messed up and it's complicated, but it's getting somewhere. If when you read the Bible as a story and you get to the last page where everyone's in heaven and it's awesome, then the mess makes sense. Then the mess kind of doesn't matter as much. But that's how you understand. Okay, so when we're looking at things in the Christian church in the 21st century, and we want to figure out if they were invented by Christians at some point in between the Bible and today, what we try to do is we try to go back to the Bible. So we would go, if you were to say to me, Darren, Christians can't have a beer or go see a movie, I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to read the Bible for like the 1000th time, and I'm going to say to you, I don't see that in the Bible. So my conclusion is, someone, somewhere along the way, just invented this. And because someone invented it, I'm going to say, nah, that's cool for you, but no, not for me. Some things are not like that. Baptism would be one of those examples. So I would go back to the New Testament and I would say, well, there's stories, Jesus got baptized, the early Christians practiced this rite, so maybe there's something in it. Certainly wasn't invented by the church, certainly is extant in the early documents of Christianity, so I would have to say that's legit. What, Mary? Now I have a really unhelpful mental image. The question you just asked is a really ancient question.
I didn't hear the question.
Well, I'll just paraphrase it in a second. So, for about 2,000 years, people have been asking this question, and the question essentially is, if it's true that Jesus died for my sin, if it's true that it's all about Jesus and not about me, if it's true that it's all about the cross and not about my behavior, then party time, right? I can do whatever I want, and it's going to be cool with God, right? That's the substance of your question. And it's a question that demonstrates an understanding of Christianity, the scandal of Christianity. To ask a question like that demonstrates that you really, really, really understand the Christian faith. It really is about Jesus and the cross and not about me. So, the straightforward answer to your question is of course not. Of course not. The Apostle Paul answered the question in this way: shall we carry on sinning so that the grace of God gets bigger in our life? No. 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 So, sorry if you were thinking that. Yeah. So no, there is a... But the approach that we take to this as Christians is interesting. We don't live a certain way in order to get God to like us. We live a certain way in response to how God likes us. Right?
Like a friend with a friend, it's not because I'm scared of you, I'm just I don't want to hurt you.
It's like having a really awesome husband or wife, right? For this really awesome husband, this really awesome wife, and they love me so much. It's just amazing being around them. They've done so much. It's just awesome. And I naturally respond to that by adjusting my behavior and doing certain things for them. And that's the kind of proper Christian response to God. I live a certain way because I'm responding to Christianity. I don't live a certain way because I'm trying to make myself Christian or be super Christian or anything like that. Awesome questions. We are way out of time. Got to go. See you next Sunday.